It's a pleasure to see so many people in person, and I understand that over 350 people are joining us online, including Julian's husband, Jean. So you're all very welcome, those of you who are joining us online. I must apologise profusely for the lack of microphones. I was not aware until this morning. There will, of course, be no charge for today's event, and I hope you might consider coming back here when I've got all the microphones in order. I'm extremely sorry. As most of you will know, this lecture is in memory of Sir Julian Priestley, who died in April 2017. He studied PPE at Balliol, and is an alumni that college can be proud of, unlike some of their alumni. And I have to say that I hold one of their alumni who studied classics, not PPE, because PPE is quite often get it in the neck. But this particular person studied classics. And I think that without this person and the myths that he created and perpetuated, and indeed, I would say the lies, we might still be proud members of the European Union. Yeah. But hey, you know, I'm not political in any way. Julian was a lifelong member of the European movement. He was president of its Europe-wide youth group, and he led the youth campaign for Europe in Britain's 1975 referendum. And he became one of the first generation of EU civil servants. And he had an outstanding career as an official of the European Parliament, which culminated in his being Secretary General from 1997 till 2007. I am particularly proud that before that, he was Secretary General of the Socialist Group. And to quote Wordsworth, bliss it was in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. And I tell you, it was. This is the fourth lecture. The first one in 2018 was given by Richard Corbett. The second given by Francis O'Grady in 2019. Then we had to skip a year because of COVID. And last year it was Bobby McDonough. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Molly Scott Cato this evening to give this year's lecture. Molly studied PPE at St Hugh's. She was an MEP for the Green Party in southwest of England from 2014 until 2020, and is now Senior Vice Chair of the European Movement. She lives in Stroud, just down the road, and just opposite where I live in the Forest of Dean. The title of this year's lecture, Energy, Security and Climate, Rethinking the UK's Place Within Europe, could not be more pertinent. The title was agreed long before the appalling war in Ukraine, the unforgivable destruction of lives, the wanton decimation of a sovereign country, a war whose impact on energy and security, and thus on our climate, is incalculable. Molly, you're very welcome. We look forward to your lecture, and afterwards there will be an opportunity for a few questions.
I haven't got a huge voice myself, so if it becomes difficult to hear, just wave at me and I'll project a bit more. But Jan, you framed that really well, and we didn't arrange this beforehand, but I was a little bit nervous that I might be rude about a certain person, but you've set the tone there, so I'll carry on in kind. But I also wanted to start with Ukraine, because I think it just wouldn't seem appropriate to talk about Europe without starting on that topic. And particularly at this time, I think we need to acknowledge the depth of our concern and our horror, really. I don't think that's too strong a word, about the events that are unfolding in Ukraine. I'm sure I actually get quite tearful about it, so I'll try not to do that, but I'm sure it's heartbreaking for all of us to see full-scale war break out in our own continent. Scenes that we had thought condemned to the history books are becoming live once again on our TV screens. I found it particularly heartbreaking that some of those who survived the deportations and murders of the Second World War are now ending their lives in the midst of another unprovoked attack on their country. As you would expect, we debated what the role of the European movement was in relation to this crisis in our continent. I'm proud to say that our excellent staff swung into action to organise a series of events, and actually that's Scott who did that, and he's sitting over there, so I'll embarrass him by congratulating him. So we organised a series of events to inform our members about what was going on, particularly in terms of how the war is reshaping foreign policy across the European Union and across its member states, and also the situation facing refugees. Of course, the appalling way they're being treated in this country, but also what's happening in other countries and on the borders of Ukraine. And I think it was completely appropriate that the European movement co-sponsored with the Mayor of London the gesture of solidarity in terms of the demonstration and vigil that happened in London in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. This event itself and the excellent speech by our CEO, Anna Bird, both emphasised how so many recognise the link between European solidarity and resistance to fascism in our own continent. I think we're all searching our consciences to ask what we could have done differently to take European history onto a different path. We can find many mistakes made by both the UK and the EU in recent years. Merkel's policy of peace through trade, though laudable and I think completely understandable, has been shown to be naive and to have underestimated the barbarity that Putin was capable of. Meanwhile, the UK suffered from the finance curse and accepted Russian gold and provided a comfortable home for Russian oligarchs, including some of those who were at the centre of the Putin regime and others who appear to have security services connections. This soul-searching is not just about the way the British government has enabled the Putin regime for more than a decade. It isn't about the way we turned a blind eye to Putin's barbarities in Syria and his many previous breaches of international treaties, whether in Georgia or in Crimea. It isn't even about the way we facilitated a comfortable life for his kleptocratic cronies in Londongrad. It is about the need to defend the way of life that has seemed invincible for my whole life. And it's an appalling tragedy, but there's a tiny glimmer of light there, which is the fact that it's woken so many people up to the need for an urgent and spirited defence of democracy and the rule of law. It was no coincidence that Putin supported Brexit. He rightly saw the European Union as a union of independent democratic nations, united in a collaborative project to defend peace in our continent. And he quite rightly saw that as a threat to his authoritarian instincts. We may all get frustrated at times about the legalistic nature of the European institutions, but these processes make it simply impossible for leaders to flout their constitutional obligations. No wonder it is opposed so strongly both by Putin and by Boris Johnson. And how important it is that the standards, these democratic standards, are defended strongly now that they are under threat within the EU's borders, in Poland and Hungary in particular. And while we're all, I'm sure, breathing a sigh of relief that Macron was victorious in France, there's nothing to celebrate in an election where a party of the far right that is closely allied to Putin and to his aims of destroying the EU can gain 4 out of 10 of the votes. It continues to be disturbing. We are in a fight against fascism in our continent. I use the word fascism, I think, advisedly, and I think we have to recognise that. Peace in Europe and the continent made up of democratic states was something that few would have dreamed possible when bombs were falling during World War II. Yet the founders of the European Union built one of the most successful peace projects in history out of the rubble of war. But we've taken peace for granted in Europe. Brexit makes it clear that we have forgotten that peace in Europe up until now has not been some sort of happy coincidence. It was built consciously and deliberately by the founding fathers of the European Union and continued by the generations of men and women. They were founding fathers, so I think I'll say that, but obviously a lot of women have also played their part since. For me, one of the most important reasons for campaigning for our place in the European Union has always been because of its ongoing commitment to active peace building in our continent. don't need to mention the person who always uses Latin, but the phrase is, if you want peace, prepare for war. But it's wrong. It should be, if you want peace, prepare for peace. That's what the European Union has done. That's why we've had peace in our continent. Sorry, I'm really emotional today. I do apologize. The war is making it very difficult, I think, to speak about a lot of things. It's really transformed the way I feel about Europe. Anyway, this is a moment that I'm sure Richard at the back and others remember, which I wanted to just say how I learned about what the European Peace Project really means as a result of becoming an MEP. And it was something that somehow just doesn't communicate outside the institutions, the way they've been created and established. And we're constantly rebuilding that sense of peace across Europe. And this is when we went back to Parliament after the 2019 elections. And this, I think it's the Youth Orchestra of Strasbourg, and they played Ode to Joy. And it's a really moving experience to see the young people of Europe and to know that we're committing so that they will have a peaceful future and they will not have to fight in our continent. And the way that especially Germany and France maintain that link, it's extremely inspiring. I see people nodding because I think you've learned that as well. I wasn't a full-on Eurosceptic, but I really didn't understand the peace mission of the European Union until I was in the Parliament myself. So I believe this peace in Europe has been a remarkable achievement. The war in Ukraine underlines the importance of peace building, active peace building, and we must not lose sight of that amongst the calls for more weapons, more spending on defence, and the reconstruction of the Cold War wall across Europe, albeit 1,000 miles to the east. I regret, although I acknowledge the need for adopting a military stance to counter Russian fascism, but as a Quaker, I refuse to give up on the vision of what Mikhail Gorbachev called our common European home. Yeah. I believe that is closer to the vision of the founders of the EU, and it demands European unity underpinned by mutual responsibilities and legal agreements, not handshakes and photo ops. As a man who gave his life to the European project, I hope and believe that Julian Priestley would share this commitment to continued peacemaking both in Europe and across the world. I want to go back to the previous slide, but I won't. I chose that slide of Julian Priestley relaxing because it just seemed, so much nicer than one in a suit, didn't it? I was very honoured to be invited to give this lecture to commemorate the life and work of Julian Priestley, although I'm sorry to say that I never actually met him. As a strong West Country patriot, I was pleased to see that he shared that affinity, and indeed that he had a close attachment to Plymouth. My father was from that great city, and I spent many happy hours as a child playing on the Hoe and swimming in the sea with my intrepid grandmother. She was a Christian communist who probably had more impact on my political outlook than any other family member. When I was elected as MEP for the South West, I was troubled that my Quaker beliefs and strong commitment to peacemaking might conflict with the values of the people of Plymouth. But in fact, I found myself deeply inspired by the extraordinary resolve and courage of Plymouth and its people. The sacrifices they made for the defence and success of our country have never been sufficiently valued or recompensed, in my view. Another more dubious connection that I share with Julian Priestley, is both of us having had run-ins with Anne Widdecombe. He, as a PPE scholar at Oxford, something the three of us actually share, and me when she was elected as an MEP from the South West in 2019. I also share with Julian an unhappy history of having stood unsuccessfully for Parliament, although I think I managed to outdo his total number of failures by 1 or 2. My next slide shows the Spitzenkandidaten candidates from 2014, and I know that Julian drew great satisfaction from establishing the precedent of the Spitzenkandidaten contest, something that Greens have also always championed. I think he shared with us a desire to flesh out European democracy, to make it about real choices between real people. Although Ursula von der Leyen is a big improvement on Jean-Claude Juncker, she is still the product of deals in closed rooms and lacks the charisma that would enable her to be a figurehead for a refreshed and revitalised European Union. I really like the organisation of this lecture. I think we on the left don't do enough to commemorate people who've made history, and we don't write our own history enough. So I think it's a great idea, and I'm really pleased to be here with you today. And I think this annual lecture is a valuable place to remember Sir Julian's contribution, but also to remind ourselves of how many British politicians and public servants shaped and nurtured the European project until the virus of Euroscepticism invaded our politics. I'm thinking especially of Lord Plum, another Gloucestershire person, who was MEP in the neighbouring constituency to mine in the Cotswolds for so many years, and who died this month after a long life of service in service of rural and agricultural communities, as well as in the EU. Plum supported Priestley's career in a way typical of the much more cooperative politics of the EU, and probably influenced his appointment as director in the Directorate General for Committees and Delegations. Those were days when many of Britain's finest political operators from all parties were central players in the EU institutions. One thinks of Pauline Green, Roy Jenkins, Chris Patten and Peter Mandelson, amongst so many others. These histories seem to have been erased in more recent debates about whether our place lay within the EU. The irony of Article 50, the article we needed to use to leave the EU, having been written by the British lawyer Lord Kerr, was probably lost on those whose propaganda falsely claimed that the EU meant unelected bureaucrats telling us what to do. The high-handed political manoeuvres of the Brexiteers dismissed the contribution of so many of Britain's most talented politicians and policymakers, and deliberately minimised the importance of the web of laws and agreements that have supported European cooperation over decades. So much easier to make snide analogies and produce a dubious piece of dog Latin than to actually investigate the many tools and processes that we have lost as a result of leaving the European Union. Since you've come to this lecture, I think I'm safe in assuming that you share my sense of enduring embarrassment and shame that we have put forward Boris Johnson, first as Foreign Secretary and now as Prime Minister. Perhaps not for very long, I hope. I'm sure we all hope. And I'm thoroughly ashamed on a daily basis at his output of the most egregious examples of political communication. I should really say propaganda, because that's what it is. Propaganda that insults our European friends and partners to advance his own standing with the backbenchers who hold his fate in their hands. I won't repeat any of the cringeworthy and offensive statements he has made, but we all understand that it was exactly this that made his career, and that his days as a Brussels journalist laid the foundation for Brexit that came later, and that it's a fallback that keeps working for him while being devastating to our European relationships and the understanding we have amongst decent governments across the world. I've been appalled by the suggestion from some commentators that Johnson is having a good war, as if his history of taking Russian cash while undermining European resistance to Putin has all been wiped away by a few handshakes on the streets of Kyiv. In memory of Julian Priestley and other genuine politicians, we should dedicate ourselves to exploring the difference between posturing to divert from domestic troubles and genuine, detailed diplomatic ties. Foreign policy, external security and defence cooperation were not explicitly covered by the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Hence, in the words of the European Commission, since the 1st of January 2021, there has been, and I'm quoting now, no framework in place between the UK and the EU to develop and coordinate joint responses to policy challenges. For instance, the imposition of sanctions on third country nationals or economies. In an article published before the end of the transition period, the Commission provided examples of specific policies and initiatives in which cooperation could be limited by the new relationship. Any participation of the UK in the EU Common Foreign and Security Policy and the Common Security and Defence Policy, including defence integration and capability development efforts, such as the European Defence Fund, permanent structured cooperation, or the coordinated annual review on defence, are now subject to strict rules on participation of third countries. The withdrawal agreement signed by Boris Johnson and ratified by Parliament came with a political declaration setting out an agreed framework for the future UK-EU relationship. In it, both sides committed to establish a broad, comprehensive and balanced security partnership that would allow us, the two sides, to work together on evolving threats, quoting again, including serious international crime, terrorism, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, hybrid threats, the erosion of the rule-based international order, and the resurgence of state-based threats. It provided for both sides to coordinate on sanctions, to share intelligence, to work jointly on cybersecurity and much else, and even for Britain to attend some EU ministerial meetings. But Boris Johnson reneged on that commitment once Brexit was ratified, which is why the TCA contains no provisions on a security partnership. This is another example of how the narrowness, the ideological narrowness of Brexit has been so damaging, since such provisions, and I think it was clear from the lists I read earlier, since such provisions would have been tailor-made for the situation we're now facing. We shouldn't exaggerate this situation, because some important aspects of foreign and security cooperation did survive into the TCA, including provisions on cooperation supporting democracy, the rule of law, human rights, prevention and prosecution of serious crimes of concern to the international community, climate change, disarmament, and non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. But it is clear that the UK is no longer involved in the formal structures of cooperation, and it seems reasonable to me to suggest that this weakening of the relationship between the EU and one of its strongest military members emboldened Putin in his decision to invade Ukraine. Rather than a treaty-based or institutional framework, we are left with informal and ad hoc arrangements. Of course, much of the narrowly defence coordination has always been undertaken by NATO, but I can't be alone in suffering distress to see the UK Foreign Minister travelling to Brussels to visit NATO headquarters, but not being part of the council meeting taking place just down the road, where the future of our own continent was being shaped. And the emphasis on the role of NATO to the exclusion of the EU is an example of the continuing ignorance and bias against the EU institutions in our British media. Because most of the tools actually used in response to the Ukraine crisis have been EU rather than NATO mechanisms. I'm thinking of successive rounds of sanctions, waiving import duties on Ukrainian products, financial assistance, cooperation on welcoming refugees, and so on. The view in some British circles that only NATO matters is plain wrong. So instead of this detailed and conscientious policy framework that was torched by the Brexiteers, we have the embarrassing fantasy of global Britain. What does it actually mean? I remember the idea of the UK joining a trans-Pacific partnership was an easy source of jokes during the period of unicorn hunting. We asked whether this related to the Pitcairn Islands, which seemed to be an appropriate overseas territory to give us a stake in the Pacific. I know that various government ministers struggle with geography. We think of Dominic Raab not really understanding the proximity of Dover to France, but suggesting that our best economic opportunities exist in the middle of the Pacific Ocean is a step into farce that surprised even me. Funny, not funny. As in many areas of this government's policy, it is hard to distinguish between posturing for political advantage inside the party or for the electorate from a genuine proposal. A recent example is Liz Truss's speech about Ukraine. Her demands that we drive Russia out of Crimea goes further even than the demands of the Ukrainian government. Her warmongering seems clearly designed to strengthen her position in the leadership race within her party. While I cannot take the suggestion that UK soldiers will be fighting again in the Crimea seriously, nor that she has the sort of nonchalance about nuclear war that she feigned in that speech, the fantasies of post-Brexit foreign policy actually make it rather difficult to tell what's a fantasy and what's real, perhaps for Liz Truss herself, I fear. Meanwhile, Johnson is seeking allies, any allies it seems, who are willing to fill the gap left by his policy of conscientiously burning bridges with European friends. Given his own willingness to play fast and loose with the Constitution and the rule of law, perhaps we should not be surprised that he seems supremely unconcerned that this means cozying up to authoritarian leaders. India's Prime Minister Modi is the latest, a leader who shares our own Prime Minister's willingness to shut down opposition and sow division and racism to bolster his own position. Again, this appears to be posturing rather than policy, with any trade deal unlikely unless the government can agree to replace the reciprocal movement of labour with our close neighbours with a one-way migration to the UK of thousands of Indian workers. Of course, the Tories have form in cozying up to dictators. Under Cameron and Osborne, we all engaged in a great national kowtow to Beijing, ignoring human rights abuses and the very real threats China already posed to both global peace and liberal democratic values. China is now Putin's strongest ally on the world stage and was also responsible for a really disreputable undermining of the Glasgow Climate Agreement together with India. This is why it's so important that we stick together as Europe and maintain those high standards and those ambitions on climate change and maintain our commitment to democracy and the rule of law. Meanwhile, in Europe, the UK is specialising in the form of anti-diplomacy perfected by Johnson as Foreign Secretary. Again, I won't repeat any of the examples because I'm sure they have your toes curling just as they have mine. The worst sort of boorish British exceptionalism seems to have blown away decades of careful diplomacy. I really sympathise deeply with those who still represent the UK in foreign capitals. But given that our foreign policy has been rooted in our EU membership for the past 40 years, it was always going to be difficult to reimagine it outside that framework. But in terms of trade and investment, the world has already delivered its verdict. At an event organised by UK in a Changing Europe last week, former member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee, Adam Posen, presented some really disturbing statistics. As this graph shows, it's demonstrating that trade openness has fallen extremely rapidly in the UK since Brexit. And you can see there it's minus 6.2% compared with increasing trade openness in European neighbours. As the graphic shows, Brexit has reduced UK's trade openness. Indeed, it was intended to do exactly that. Posen, he presented a whole slew of slides full of really depressing and concerning data, actually. But some of the data he presented shows that Brexit has significantly and suddenly reduced foreign direct investment inflows and also inflows of people, inward migration. There are no surprises here. And all the economists who had not taken the Brexit shilling predicted exactly these consequences. It was inevitable that deliberately introducing border frictions and higher transport costs would pose new barriers to trade. Posen actually predicts that FDI inflows are unlikely to return to levels reached in 1990s and the 2000s, and that basically means ever. We've shot ourselves in the foot at just the time when there is increasing competition from Asian countries. Meanwhile, we see the Minister for Unicorn Hunting, otherwise known as Jacob Rees-Mogg, has suddenly become the person that tells us that implementing the treaty his government negotiated would be an act of self-harm. I mean, yeah, what can you say? You're through the looking glass when that sort of thing happens. But all the same, this has done nothing to undermine his pride that Johnson has got Brexit done. Now, I apologise for moving on now to another one of the 21st century horsemen of the apocalypse, but this is the one that's been driving my political interests for my whole life, and so you won't be surprised that I need to talk about this, and I'm talking, of course, about the climate crisis. The link between the action we need to take on the climate crisis and the war in Ukraine is really obvious. We've learned how our addiction to fossil fuels has left us dependent on Putin and how it gave him the confidence to defy NATO. And of course, we've been funding both his kleptocratic regime and his war in Ukraine. In the first 2 months of the year, EU countries have sent about €1 billion a day to Russian coffers in return for fossil fuels. In the UK, the failure of energy policy has led us to repeatedly miss our climate targets and to domestic consumers facing unpayable bills or even dying as a result of living in cold homes. But here I think we do have more of a positive future to sketch out, because making ourselves independent of Russian energy as rapidly as possible gives us another incentive, if one were needed, to rapidly eliminate fossil fuels from our economies. Simon Evans of Carbon Brief has calculated that there are 649 onshore wind and solar projects ready to go right now with planning permission that we could start building them from today. If they all went ahead, they'd save more gas than we currently import from Russia. Incidentally, he also calculated that Cameron's decision to do, as he said, cut the green crap, now costs each household in England £150 a year, ending onshore wind projects, which is the cheapest way of generating renewable energy, solar subsidies and energy efficiency schemes has added to inflated bills. As in so many other things, and you won't be surprised to hear me say this as a Green, I look enviously across the North Sea to Berlin. The German Greens negotiated an energy transition as part of the demands they made during the negotiations over the coalition deal. And I'm watching with enthusiasm as Robert Habeck establishes his super ministry within the finance ministry to enable Europe's largest economy to go fossil free. But the war in Ukraine has massively boosted ambition, and Habeck is enabled to go much faster, much further, much faster. The slide demonstrates the plan to install renewable energy capacity across Germany up to 2035. I should point out it's not cumulative. This is what they're going to be installing every year. Onshore wind in pale blue, solar in yellow, and offshore wind in navy. So because of the war in Ukraine, there was a revised package announced earlier this month, and it doubles the target for renewable energy from 40% to 80% in terms of the electricity generation mix. And for the first time, renewables are explicitly acknowledged as being a public security requirement. The country's Renewable Energy Sources Act also includes a goal for offshore wind energy to reach at least 30 gigawatts by 2030, equivalent to the capacity of 10 nuclear plants, and at least 70 gigawatts by 2045. The European Green Deal is similarly ambitious and has also been given a boost by the Ukraine war. The nature of renewable energy means that energy cooperation between neighbours is essential. This demonstrates the interconnectors that we already have running. Essentially, wind is not constant. So as a frontal system moves across Europe, different countries are able to generate electricity. And when they're able to generate electricity from wind, then they share it with the countries where the wind hasn't reached yet, using these interconnectors. So we're all now connected in an enormous sort of grid that works right across Europe. And more of these are being installed all the time, as you can see from the graphic. So essentially, we already have interconnectors with Norway, Belgium and Ireland, and they're already supplying a significant portion of our electricity, and we're repaying in kind as the southwesterlies blow across our continent. I know only a Green could feel romantic about renewable energy, but I do enjoy the sense of energy flowing across our continent, and I see it as an inevitable form of cooperation that still binds us together, cooperation in action. That's not why I feel romantic about it, but it is another reason I'm really keen on it. So let's compare this with the flimsy series of media announcements I hesitate to call an energy strategy, which represents above all a political failure. There was nothing for people struggling with fuel bills because they don't vote Conservative. There was nothing about wind farms, no new wind farms because Tory backbenchers find them unsightly. And there was a fake £120 million support for nuclear power, which will leave us with a big hole in our electricity supply when private finance fails to fill the gaps. Somebody can't do their sums here because they say there'll be 8 nuclear power stations. Hinkley, just down the road from me, is costing at least 50 billion. So what is this 120 million going to do? It's like the 120 million that they gave to Rwanda. It seems to be 120 million. It's just a sort of fake amount of money to pretend something's happening. Another example of political failure. Meanwhile, in Germany, the super ministry is now working on legislation to raise the energy efficiency requirement of buildings and reduce emissions from transport. The government has already announced a proposal to introduce a flat rate public transport fare to address the rising cost of living and encourage people away from private transport and towards public transport. For me, the most exciting aspect of Habeck's department is that he's taking charge of the transition, not just of energy efficiency, energy supply and transport, but also of Germany's really large and energy intensive industry. We're all going to watch as Germany leads Europe into the green economy of the future while we're languishing in the past. We have to find a way to build a similar government with similar levels of ambition here in the UK. because there's a really bright future here. It's a future of warm homes, lower bills, and good quality jobs in communities across the country. Another thing that we're keen on as Greens, which I'm sure you know, is insulation. But what we say is that the cheapest bill is the bill you don't have to pay, because your home is so well insulated, you don't need to heat it, and you're not losing heat through the windows. I am a bit of a convert here because I've recently had my home insulated and had a heat pump installed, and it was actually switched on the day that Putin invaded Ukraine, and I bought a sticker on there and it says, "This machine kills fascists," so I'm rather pleased with myself. But the outrageous thing about it is I could only afford to do that because I was so overpaid as an MEP that I stashed savings, and I've been able to afford it. Most people just can't do that, and that's what's so wrong, that it needs to be a publicly funded insulation programme. But anyway, that's a positive future we could imagine. It will create jobs. It will create jobs in all communities and reduce our demand for energy, climate wins, warmer homes, cheaper bills. Also, public transport. As I said, Germany is now making public transport much cheaper. That's the way to get people out of their cars. It's not to ban their cars, not to make petrol more expensive. You have to provide the alternative. That well-known radical organisation, the Campaign for the Protection of Rural England, has recommended that every place should have a bus every hour that's cheaper than using your car. As somebody that gave up my car and really struggled to get around as a consequence, I couldn't agree more. And we can also have 15-minute neighbourhoods where you can get what you need close to home and can reduce your need to travel while supporting local businesses. Most importantly, we need to find a way to stop energy companies from profiting from the bad housing stock into which they put their overpriced energy, which is then just disappearing through the walls and the windows. The public agrees strongly with this. Insulating homes is the top public priority, with 84% of those surveyed saying this was the best way to reduce the use of Russian gas. So, to conclude, I have covered some fairly concerning topics in this lecture, but it feels like we're living in serious times, and I wanted to cover serious issues. And it is frightening to be living both at a time when there's a war in our continent and to be living through a climate emergency. But I think this suggestion of what a world could look like if we organised ourselves to deal with the climate crisis is a hopeful note to conclude on, because tackling the climate crisis makes cooperation inevitable, and it is closely aligned with our need to resist the authoritarian power of those who control the world's fossil fuels, whether in Moscow or in Riyadh. But we need to recognise these connections and recognise that our failure to address this crisis is a sign of the malaise of our democracy. Without revitalising democracy, we cannot address the challenges facing us. What is happening in the world right now, in Ukraine, in Hungary, in France, and in our own country, is exactly, I believe, what Julian Priestley gave his life to prevent. We are seeing a full-scale attack on the democratic institutions that he spent his life building and strengthening, and the sort of war that the European institutions were created to prevent. I would like to end this lecture by giving thanks for the life of Julian Priestley and all those who ensured that my generation has never had to fight, and by asking you to dedicate your energies to supporting those institutions and that vision, and to working with the European movement and with others to energise the rapidly building campaign to rejoin the European Union. Thank you.
Molly, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure that we all wholeheartedly agree that Julian really did give his life to building European democracy, to extending democracy, to prosperity amongst the nations of the European Union, but also to peace. And all too often people forget why the European Union was founded. We learned a lot there, and I can assure you it's not just Greens who care about public transport, and I'm sure you do. No, we do as well, yeah.